worth mentioning the origins of DIMES. A lot of people in this room have influenced our thinking around putting together this project. A lot of us work specifically on Africa's relations with the European Union, and that very much influenced our construction of that, trying to interrogate the nature of that relationship and where that relationship is going. At the same time, more theoretical scholarship around the decolonial has really, I guess, it's kind of a fire's been lit under sort of the decolonial within the European space in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, of course. And of course, there are also more senior scholars who've been working on ideas around disruption and decentering for a while now, all of which you can read about in our UACES journals, GCFS, and JSA. And so it's with that in mind that we decided to create this roundtable, which is titled Disruption, What, Where, and When. This roundtable is quite fluid in that we try to be as non-prescriptive as possible, but to sort of create a space for discussion and to sort of start us off on that. We've got four, of our fellow travelers, if we can get our fourth online, but I'll start with those who are here. We've got Antonio Salvador Alcazar, the third, Camille Nestel, and Bruno Teodoro Luciano, who will be speaking here in the room, and Bacha Kabede de Bella, who is supposed to be online if we're able to get them. But I'll start perhaps with Camille. Over to you.
Okay, so thank you very much for inviting me and for having me also to join this roundtable. So it's also going to be my first roundtable, so I'm also excited to see how this will go. So my name is Camille Nestel. I'm a PhD fellow at University Libre de Bruxelles and also at Ghent University. And I am researching in my PhD, which is about to be handed in, like somewhere at the end, by the end of the year, hopefully, on the post-colonial perspectives on Indonesia. So basically, I'm analyzing how Indonesia and Vietnam frame EU identity in the context of sustainable development clauses included in trade agreements. And for this special issue, and I was writing together with Antonio, who's a bit late, but he's coming here he should be here anytime soon. And also with Jan, we were writing together on how to decolonize TSD chapters. So basically, one of the questions that we have received to basically kick off this roundtable was, what does disrupting European studies mean to you? And that also, of course, drawing on the experience of my own research. So as such, I never really planned initially to disrupt any dialogue. This was not how I started. It's just more something that automatically happened by doing the kind of research I was doing. Because my work is focusing on perception of others. And I think one of the best examples is also, of course, one of the first submissions I was doing with my trying to analyze EU-Indonesia relations from a post-colonial perspective. And one of the answers was like, sorry, we cannot process this submission. It's not actually about EU external relations. So, and this is how it all started. And by this, you automatically start by disrupting what does it actually mean, EU external relations, and also trade and sustainable development chapters in this context. So also as such, obviously I never had a strictly post-colonial perspective, but it's more of the post-colonial with a hyphen that I'm using, where I'm saying, okay, if we say meaning making is so important in analyzing our own history about the European integration and so forth, I mean the whole post-imperial project of the EU is about the narrative of it starting as a peace project and so forth. We also need to take this colonial experience much more into account of the others and how this influences, of course, into actions. And so, as such, my research is more into, I would say, more situated on the interpretivist camp of European studies. But but I'm very interested in seeing the experience of the others. And seeing the experience of the others, for me, what happened is that the whole way of analyzing it more and more, I think I started to take a more post-colonial perspective without a hyphen. So this is what happened because I saw that there were so many Eurocentrisms happening in the EU studies, starting with the way people talk about great sustainable development chapters and so forth, how they situated the debate, how they started off the debate, and also what they excluded from the narrative. And all of the colonial past that is like accompanying EU external relations was not there. So by that, I forcefully had to ask, like, okay, so what leads us there? What's coming? Like, how come that this is so much excluded from it? And by basically finding some allies in the literature, and most of them were in post-colonial studies, then obviously I was able to make much more sense of it. And then there was, of course, it started very innocent with the Fischer, Ona, and Nicolaitis on the decentering agenda, and then it moved forward more to really post-colonial, decolonial literature of Sabahat Anam and so forth. And there, notably, when I saw like the avatars of Eurocentrism that were there, I was able to really grasp of, okay, how come really that we talk about Christine chapters in the way we do. So disrupting for me means opening basically the door to the perspective of the other, and by that we will automatically put into question Eurocentrism, the EU narrative as such, and all the Eurocentrism that actually block us from seeing others. So yeah, this is more or less, I would say, my answer to that.
Perfect, thank you. So y'all have to speak a bit louder.
I think we might all die in here if I shut the door,
But I mean, it's up to you.
So actually, you sort of linked us right in well into sort of how do we sort of get at Eurocentrism in particular? And I'll hand over now to Bruno to get us a bit of it, because I think you bring a really interesting Brazilian perspective.
Try to speak a bit about it, just to make sure that everyone in the room can hear me. Yeah, my name is Bruno Luciano. I'm from Brazil. I'm now a postdoc fellow at the São Paulo State University. We have a graduate program in IR. And when I started to engage with the DIMES project, and probably this is more pretty much linked to what Tony already mentioned, right? So try to look at Eurocentrism, but also look at regionalism more broadly and consider how to move away from Eurocentrism in our own world. So this is pretty much what I've done in my thesis, where I try to compare the evolution of regional parliaments such as the European Parliament with similar parliamentary institutions in Africa, the case of the Pan-African Parliament in the African Union, and the Mercosur Parliament in South America. And when I started this research, what I realized was that pretty much the same process as you, that we usually start the narrative by a European way of telling things, or how things, even when we compare different regional progress. Because I'm not saying that the European experience wasn't considered by parliamentarian actors and parliamentary institutions outside Europe. They were. But it's not just about that, right? So I think this bringing this more disruptive dialogue has pretty much to do with trying to look at historical legacies of these regional organizations, right? In understanding there is European diffusion out there, but understanding also that, in my case, parliamentary agents, local parliamentarians, right, from African countries, South American countries, they have a key role in developing their own institutions in, obviously, in asymmetric international environment. And in particular for the DIMES project, my co-author Dina Sebastian from the University of Coimbra is here. We try to look at lessons from the poly-crisis from European studies and global South regions. So we try to look at the main responses from both the global South and the EU for particular crises, which are the financial crisis, migration crisis, and COVID, and try to look at whether EU studies and comparative visions help us to provide a more interdisciplinary and less centric perspective to how we understand regional responses in terms of these crises. And then what we try to do is, and what we think it's a bit disruptive, is not just departing from the EU experience, but departing from the criticism of Eurocentrism as a starting point to understand responses of regional organizations out there. And then we try to look at not the EU as a model for regional responses for these crises, but just as a comparable case, right? And try to look at these organizations more in a more balanced way, especially because we were interested in when trying to disrupt the idea of Eurocentrism, of EU studies and regional and comparative regions in the sense is trying to bring local and regional responses from the global south, which not necessarily follow the same path that Europeans have followed when responding to those crises. At the same time, we also detected some similar patterns, and I think it's also important to look at. Right? And for example, and then I'll just go back to the whole discussion, I think besides Eurocentrism in this way of challenging how the EU as a model is always understood by regional organizations and how they will respond to crisis, we also looking at studies that try to observe and identify the responses for regional organizations in the global south. We also saw that there's an elite centrism in those studies, right? So how we usually think about the responses. These responses are usually coming from political and sometimes economic elites, right? And this is also works for global south regionalism. And this is interesting that we also could share. Another thing that we try to do in the process, and that was one of the feedbacks we got from the DIMES group. And that was one feedback from one of the colleagues in the workshop we organized was trying to, because usually the narrative starts by the EU, telling what the EU has done on those crises. And then we try to look at the South. So we try in this text to do the opposite. Start by first what the South has done and trying to address these three crises, and then we move on to look at the EU as well. Right? So this is also a disruptive way of trying to say, okay, well, how these, again, the elites, because I think this is an elite-driven process, the responses, but how can we try to shift, right, disrupt the way we understand these studies that have been published, trying to follow those crises. So I think I'll stop by here, and then I can come back with more on Eurocentrism if you want, Tony.
Yeah, I think it was really interesting is sort of that ability to speak to centering other spaces within European studies is a really unique way of disrupting. And I would be keen to hear from Stephen how that sits with the theorizing of decentering, but maybe we'll hold that to the next time. I wanted Antonio to settle in first, but you came in at the perfect time because we haven't gotten our colleague online yet, so it might just be the three of you. But Antonio, our third speaker, and I asked Antonio to think about the historical context of where we're at. I guess he's sort of part historian, so I'll let you explain how you can have that.
Yeah, first of all, let me apologize. I was running from the European ISA in Athens, and it was a long hike from there. And I ended up in the wrong building. But anyway, thank you for the question. But I'd like maybe to preface what I'm about to say that I'm not a historian by training. I did IR and European studies from outside Europe in Manila, and I think that would be the context of my intervention today. I'd like to make two general points. One on what I see would be the globalization of European studies, and then secondly, how can we rethink historically the politics of trade in new historical knowledges from the perspective of new historical challenges. So the first point would be about, yes, I think especially in the last 2 decades, we see more and more students interested in European studies from outside Europe. And I think my experience in Manila kind of is a small testament to that, that you have more and more people from the global south studying Europe from outside Europe, but then there are also students coming to Europe to study European politics and the place of EU-Europe in world politics. But I think the problem is that Eurocentrism persists in our curricular thought and praxis. And this is why I think more and more radical student initiatives have been questioning the place of the university in Europe and outside Europe, where some ways of knowing and learning are deemed more privileged, more desirable, more legitimate, more scientific than others. And I think this is really a huge problem in our paper on EU trade policy. We try to address this through decolonial ways of thinking and working. And there are plenty of examples from Latin America, indigenous universities there trying to question Eurocentrism in the way that we understand world politics. The Decolonize Our Universities initiative, which used to be a transnational movement in Malaysia, where really different IR scholars from the Southeast Asian region primarily question kind of, okay, why do we study IR, but then geopolitically we're located in Southeast Asia, but then Eurocentrism persists in our classrooms. So a lot of these initiatives, and also in Europe you see a lot of initiatives as well from Ghent University in Oxbridge and other UK universities, and also in my own university at CEU, which is a European American university, and that university, I think, if I may say so, kind of sees itself as not implicated in the coloniality of our knowledge regimes, because it's a post-1989 university. But then I argue that even young universities without former colonial legacies have the responsibility to challenge what some call the geopolitics of the curriculum as a mode of, and here I'm quoting Jairo Funes Flores, which is an excellent Latin American decolonial scholar. So what he calls the geopolitics of the curriculum as a way or as a mode of perpetuating, quote unquote, the coloniality of power and knowledge that endure even after political decolonization. So my claim is that even a small university like mine, who came into existence like well beyond kind of formal colonial orders, should try to question their curricular thought and praxis, especially on European studies, as more and more international students from outside Europe come to these university spaces in the global north to learn about Europe, but then Europe's relationships with other parts of the world. So that would be, I don't know if I have more time to reflect on very briefly on the second point. So going back to my preface earlier, I think it's really a big problem that we are confined or delimited by the problem of disciplinary boundaries. That I had to claim that that it would be difficult for me as an IR political scientist student to kind of rethink the EU / Europe historically, because I wasn't trained as a historian. But I think in our paper with Camille and Jan, one of our contentions was that it's important to historicize silences and erasures in the ways in which we learn and study about Europe in its modern history, and how other histories are implicated in Europe's own history, and that we have to resuscitate these submerged historical knowledges. Just as by way of a small example, so I study the unilateral aspect of EU trade policy, which came about in the 1970s, and the EU likes to think of this type of arrangement as a sort of, as a gift, as a post-colonial gift, and as a sign of EU benevolence that kind of is detached from the whole story of the EU's dark legacies, as they like to kind of allude to that history. So it's delinked from the broader questions around the anti-colonial, decolonial struggles that are then implicated in this very transnational preferential trading arrangement. And we have to look at that, for example, from the perspective of the garment workers in Myanmar, in Bangladesh, in Cambodia, and how they are implicated in this coloniality of trading arrangements by the EU in a historical sense.
I think what's really interesting is, as part of the broader decolonial project, I think perhaps we're kind of late to it within quote-unquote European studies, is
part of what we're trying to do is move away from the elite narrative, because one of the things that I sort of drew out of all your talks was this idea that even in critique, elitism sort of perpetuates Eurocentrism in a certain way. But actually, if we sort of shift the focus to the marginal, i.e. the garment workers in Myanmar, as a way of understanding, for example, EU trade or impacts of EU trade or globalization broadly, we might learn something different about global political economy as a field and then its sort of practice. But we're still kind of behind, because that is not how GP is taught, even sort of critical GP. So I guess that's something for us to learn from. But I am, the one thing that I do keep coming back to is a lot of times, I mean, it's really comfortable to use the term Eurocentrism because it's, we're critiquing European studies here. But fundamental to those who critique Eurocentrism is they're saying you need to take issues of race within the global power hierarchy seriously, and not the sort of really childish way that we understand race as they talk about on TV, but sort of, as a structure of relations. And this is one thing that I'm happy to talk about in my own work, talk to my students about, but this is something that is lacking within even sort of more critical aspects of comparative regionalism, certainly the big sort of IR, IPE. But I think I want to end on sort of the point that Antonius just made about disciplinarity. I think one of the, if I may speak for everybody, the reasons why we found a bit of comfort in the sort of umbrella of European studies is that people from different quote-unquote disciplines can come together. But by and large, we still end up shoving ourselves within disciplines. So, I'm still an art, you're still trade, and you're still a GPE. What is that? And I just wonder, can we really achieve an mastery project if the university and even us, and there are good reasons for why we're disciplinary. It's because of where we have to publish. We do have obligations to our employers. But that's something that would be really useful for us to think about. I don't have a solution, but I have been thinking about it more and more because, as you said, there's so much knowledge, and I'm really glad that you cited Hiro because he's been such an inspiration to me since COVID started. Yeah, you doom scroll a lot on Twitter when you have nothing else to do, but then you end up finding really useful pockets of academic and in this case decolonial Twitter that you really learn from. But I'm going to keep quiet now and rather open up the space for if people have any sort of questions, comments, rants, and provocations. Unfortunately, I can't get alcoholic.
I have something of a provocation. I feel
Yeah.
bad about this, so forgive me. I really love all this stuff. You know I do. This is kind of the stuff I like, right? But I think, in terms of thinking about historically about the European Union and European Union studies and its kind of global role and, the interactions between different parts of the world, I think it's really important to remember that there has been a really strong history of disruption, of academic disruption, but we've chosen to ignore it to the wider extent, right? And European studies tends to be a kind of safe space for kind of liberalism and that kind of stuff, and the kind of more radical writings have been ignored. So it's not that this stuff hasn't been there, and there's been some really, really radical stuff. You're talking about, the Caribbean relationship with the European Union. You've got Walter Rodney, you've got Ravenhill on collective clientelism. This is all stuff from the 1970s, and this is stuff that was writing about the GSP and about aspects of trade in terms of Bandung Conference and the new International Economic Order and all of that kind of stuff. So there has been a history of radicalism. What we've, as a discipline, done is ignored it. So while this attempt at disruption is welcome, and it's a really good thing, in terms of understanding our own position in disruption, we've got to recognise that we've been kind of complicit in ignoring the disruptions that have been going on for the last 40 odd years, but we've chosen not to centre it.
And I don't know how anybody can do EU external relations and not have read the book. But I'm also here to tell you that throughout my education, the 10 years of university, not a single soul suggested that book to me. Not a single soul. And I think you're absolutely right that, it has absolutely been there. But only when you speak to people who do international development outside of EU studies, because we've always been very special. EU development is great, but it's not really regular international development, right? And I think you're absolutely right. Because one of the things we've tried to do with the DIMES project is to create a reading list. So we're very keen on sourcing, open sourcing. So if you have any suggestions, feel free to either send them to myself or Emily or Marina, and we'll just put them on the website because we think, just more should do more of it. I don't know how many of you actually read it in university, but I can tell you that I read it only after. I got to it just before my PhD ended, and I'm like, this is the stuff I've been saying. Another question: how many of you have read the Treaty of Rome?
Too much shame.
Yeah, the reason I asked that question is because I did expect a lot of hands to go up, but I remember that when I was doing my PhD, there was this tiny part in the Treaty of Rome that talks about the EU's relationship with its former colonies. And yet, the whole literature that I read up until all of the literature when I was doing my PhD said the EU's foreign policy didn't really start until the 1990s, and I'm like, are we reading the same document here? So, even when you've done the reading, is it really filtering through in a way, I would say, as objectively as it should? Because actually, the fact that a lot of people did not clock that until about 10 years ago, in terms of the broader scholarship, like for instance, like few people clocked that, also suggests the sort of the hegemony of institutions and how the ways in which we're taught and the ways in which basically we tend to reproduce me us. Frank, you had your hand up.
Yes, I have a question that relates a bit to especially Antonio and Bruno. You mentioned that you may want to chip in also about knowledge production on the EU, on European studies from the outside. And there's something I've been trying to grappling with for a while. Is this if you envisage sort of a research center on Europe, on the EU outside, is this, first of all, is this something that is actually a priority, or is this not just then reproducing Eurocentricity in the sense of the EU is still the most important thing, and therefore we need to study it, and the priority should be then rather something else, or if it's a priority to have more knowledge on Europe and the EU, so how should that be structured? Because you can't just reproduce sort of a European or British sort of EU study center. So what type of approach or what type of structure also what you see as being pertinent to
Yeah, so I think I would maybe approach this question from the perspective of geopolitics. It's very important that Walter Mignolo talks so much about the locus of enunciation, where we situate ourselves and where we understand and see the world. So that's, for example, when I study the EU from Manila and the Philippines history, it would be very different to, for example, how the EU, Europe would appear from the perspective of Latin American scholars, or from here, from Belgium. So I think it's to recognize that, and that there are centers of knowledge cultivation in other places in the world that don't necessarily take the face of, how they are built here as, EU study centers. Or, for example, in the Philippines, there's the Third World Studies Research Center in the University of the Philippines, and I think they try to develop also critical research programs around the US or